I don't know whether it's possible to cultivate a style.
Nobody is precisely what they think they are. Love is where you find it, where you find it, where you find it. Love is where you find it.
Maybe in the last moments of my life, I will be curious to know what it means to die.
Welcome to Folk Phenomenology. My name is Sam Rocha. Today is episode 3 of season 1, featuring special guest Kaya Oakes on writing and composition. Today's episode was originally recorded on March 9th, 2021. Folk Phenomenology is sponsored by Whip and Stock Publishers, publishers of my 2015 book, Folk Phenomenology, Education, Study, and the Human Person. Give Us This Day, Daily Prayer for Today's Catholic, the Institute for Christian Socialism, Building a Movement of the Ecumenical Christian Left, Solidarity Hall, Eden plus Utopia, Revelation Cable Company, Vancouver Custom Cables and Pedalboard Solutions, Black Catholic Messenger, an online publication for Black Catholics. Where Peter is, there is the Church, and the Juan Diego Network, Catholic audio for Latinos. The featured sponsor for today's episode is Commonweal Magazine, the leading lay Catholic voice for commentary on religion, politics, and culture. All listeners of Folk Phenomenology are eligible for a whole year subscription to Commonweal for only $9.95. You can find a link to that promotion in the show notes. Also in the show notes, you'll find some of Kaya Oakes' writing in Commonweal. She's a frequent author there. Her recent review of the book American Prophets, titled Is There a Religious Left?, is a particularly good, I think, introduction to her authorship of several books and numerous essays and articles and commentaries and reviews. So please take a look in the show notes to see and find some of that reading. If you would like to support Folk Phenomenology, please consider sharing this episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite app or platform, and maybe leave a review or a rating, or you can also drop a tip. You can also find Folk Phenomenology on social media with dedicated accounts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. In last week's episode, in dialogue with Jeannie Gaffigan, we used her book When Life Gives You Pears as a lens of sorts to really get into her autobiography, not only her story, but also her story of her family and her marriage. And that took us all the way to the universal themes of tragedy and comedy and suffering and the tragicomic. In this week's episode with Kaya Oakes, we enter the discussion through the lens of poiesis. In Greek, the word poiesis simply means to make, and in this sense, that's what we mean, I think, when we say composition within the realm of writing, prose, and even poetry. Kaya opens this world up to us at a molecular level, entering into some granular details about how to write and how to edit, but also talking about the world of writing today, both within the academy and also outside of it in more public-facing and popular writing. But at the heart of the interview is the animating force of this fundamental relationship between the word and the world, between language and speech, that not only makes talk, but speaks the world into existence. This, I think, is truly the atomic core element of this very detailed discussion of writing. We're ultimately entering into the craft, the poiesis, not only of making books and articles and essays, but even of, perhaps, making the world itself by naming the world. This naming does invite a kind of poetic conceit. It can risk a kind of over-universalization, but Kaya wisely steers us away from that in this interview and brings us into the depth of difference to delight in the world without consuming it. Dilexit mundum. Thank you so much for being here with me, Kaya.
Thanks for asking me, Sam.
You are a poet, in addition to being a writer of various kinds and an award-winning poet. It's something that I find, frankly, fascinating about your work as a writer. You seem to basically work in every genre, as far as I can tell. Is that fair?
Well, I don't write fiction.
Okay.
And I don't write screenplays.
Okay.
And I actually haven't written any poetry in about 10 years. But I will say that as an essayist and nonfiction writer, I think that my background as a poet, you'd be surprised to find out how many essayists started out as poets. So Ta-Nehisi Coates, Joan Didion, Baldwin, many of the great essayists started as poets. And I think it's because that close attention to language is really something that the essay or nonfiction writing needs more of, and that elevation of language is important. So yeah, I've tried to write fiction, but I'm just god-awful at it, so yeah.
Well, in addition to all these things, just to kind of bring things in a bit more of an anecdotal closeness here, you're also a very unsparing, I would say, editor. And I'm speaking here from personal experience. I was lucky to be able to have you do an early editorial review of Folk Phenomenology, my 2015 book. And I recall, like it was yesterday, your calling out the cliche in not only my writing, but even you said, yeah, philosophers and academics, you all think cliches are sort of effective ways of communicating, but they're actually not, right? And also called out my use of repetitive adjectives, especially trios. And I tell you what, I've written a little bit of poetry, and I've had the ability to get some critiques from poets who, fiercely attack your line breaks and stuff like that. And that was the way that critique and that edit felt. And it was so good. And it's so rare. Because in philosophy, most of the time, peer reviewers, they want you to think they're smart. And philosophers think that if you critique form, you're like not going after the right stuff, But I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about actually like composition, and in some sense, this interval between the poetic and the prosaic, because I think it's important. I've seen it do work in my own writing by your own critical eye and hand, and I'm sure you have like troves and troves of things to share about it. What do you think about that as a topic?
Yeah, sure, we can go for it. I think I'm in the midst of a batch of essay grading with my undergrad students right now, and I've been thinking a lot about this question of like, how do we give people feedback on their writing, and how do they receive it? Do they receive it with grace and openness, or do they receive it with hostility? And in the academy, as you know, in the upper echelons of the academy, so when you get into postgrads and writing for academic journals and publishing dissertations and stuff, the feedback gets more and more tends to be so focused on ideas and less about how those ideas are being expressed. At the same time, we have this parallel stream where academics are increasingly wanting to, and for the sake of bringing attention to their disciplines in the humanities, as we know, we have to do public scholarship, because otherwise students don't want to study philosophy. Or the whole Cornel West situation is fascinating to me, that he was lured by Harvard because of his public profile, but then criticized for doing too much public scholarship. And it's like, it's Cornel West.
They already went through this a few years ago when he left the first time, right? Like they didn't learn their lesson.
Right, I don't know if you saw, he just left again. So
yeah, he's going to Union now, yeah.
Going back, right.
Yeah, going back.
So that's fascinating to me, because he's such an example of somebody whose scholarship and writing is accessible to a broader public, is influential outside of the academy, is known outside of the academy, and yet has serious academic chops. And there are many, many other people you and I both interact with or follow on social media who would fall into these categories as well. And yet the reception to editing in academic writing is very hostile a lot of the time when it comes to editing for style, which is what I think that style and voice are such a huge part of getting these more obtuse ideas across to people outside of the discipline. So a friend of mine, who's a theologian, commented on this, that he started to write for America or Commonweal and said, had a PhD and had published a lot of academic articles. And he said, I've never had somebody pay that much attention to my actual writing. And it was because, again, it's not about the writing, it's about other things.
And I actually think you might be being too generous there. I mean seriously, right? So like I'm basically trained in the academy, and I was one of those. My college thought it was a good idea to give honors students exemptions from taking basic composition on the assumption that they had mastered all those things in high school. And I was not someone who had done that, right? So I had never taken any serious courses in composition or in writing. And I found that I had to essentially remedially read manuals and Paris Review because I thought the prose there looked like, top shelf. And so I just, monkey see, monkey do, and read, Strunk and White and Fowler and all that kind of stuff and put my stuff together. But one of the things I found that in my field is one's writing, if it's aesthetically quality, one will actually be critiqued for that. So you will actually be told, it's a very poetic writer, a very good writer. And that actually it's a put down at the conference. What's that about? Have you seen that before?
I think it's a suspicion of cheap ideas. And what I mean by that is the sense that you're not a serious scholar if you're writing in this way that is only comprehensible to 5 people, in a very narrow field. And I think it is this suspicion of, of taking our knowledge and giving it to people who don't deserve it or haven't earned it because they are not part of our little bubble world. And it's been a while since I was in Vancouver, but I seem to remember that the campus of UBC is sort of similar to Berkeley's, which is that we are porous within the city. There's no walls around campus. The city is, it's like NYU or other urban schools where we're really in the town.
Sure.
And it feels so different from somewhere like the college where I used to teach, which is out in the suburbs and completely isolated, and the students are just living in this little bubble. And how many of colleges are like that? And in COVID, we're learning, how much that model is a failure anyway. Mm-hmm. But it is that representative of the citadel of knowledge being, only for the few and not the many. And then when you begin to write in ways that are recognizable as populist, for lack of a better word, that people become suspicious that you're not a serious scholar. And that's what people have often told me, grad students. And I'd love to write, my research is on this really fascinating, super relevant topic, and I'd love to write about it and pitch it to the New York Times or whatever, but I'm afraid I won't be taken seriously.
Right.
And I'm like, it's the New York Times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know if that makes sense in answer to your question. I do think it is this kind of fear of style, this kind of suspicion of style as being less serious in some way. Totally.
I mean, you brought up Cornel West, and there's kind of 2 directions I see here, but he gave a speech at it wasn't like Arizona State University. It was like State University of Arizona, or like some kind of, not ASU, public school, and there was a reporter. I think it was like maybe a student reporter or a local journalist who covered it in sufficient detail that they provided some pull quotes from the speech. But I haven't been able to find the transcript or a video or anything of it. But he has this phrase that they quote verbatim, where he says, "Education is what stirs the soul." And that line, that phrase, might capture for me, whatever, philosopher of education, blah blah blah. Like that may be the most economical expression I can point to anywhere that expresses some actually descriptive account of education that I'm comfortable with kind of playing ball with there, right? And it's coming off of essentially a pulpit on at an academic, talk, but very much popular, covered in the media, not recorded. It's not in a book he wrote or anything like that, but education is what stirs the soul. I feel like it has everything inside of it. I wonder if we can think about those things like these phrases between that kind of poetic and prosaic line. Would you mind being as technically provoked as to talk a little bit about just like line breaks and sentence length and clause length? Because I think this is the nitty gritty, right? And I never get to talk to anyone about it because no one wants to talk to me about style. So here we are.
Sure. I mean, it's really about, you're a musician, so it's really about what the music of the writing. And this again is, if you have 5 minutes, there's a video on, you can Google Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Atlantic, and he does a 5-minute video about style in prose writing. And one of the things he talks about is matching the music of the verse to what it sounds like in your head. And that is what the process of writing really is in my head I'm hearing these things, and on the page I'm seeing these things, this octopus that's growing and growing and growing and going, and so sentence variety is part of that, so much in the way that percussion works in music. So a long sentence is to stretch out an idea, short sentences to make a point or to have an impact. A series of shorter sentences will also continue to draw readers' attention to something. Deliberate, there was a kind of vogue a few years ago for sentence fragments,
Yeah.
So I am telling you that this is my point, and it drove me nuts because I get that that's trying to mirror language, spoken language, but there's a way to do that without, I think it's good to bend the rules of grammar, but not break them necessarily, although then that gets into these issues like Gloria Anzaldúa talks about of whose English is it, and
Sure.
who does it belong to. But aside from putting aside the cultural side of this conversation, which is a really important one,
That's the other road I was thinking of.
Yeah, the other issue is just thinking about your work as being, if you think of your work as frozen on a page, then you won't ever really enjoy writing, because writing is the living thing, and if the manipulation of language is part of making it sound good to the reader. So I really recommend to my students all the time to read their work out loud, and how much they actually do it, I don't know.
Sure.
But a painful but helpful exercise for us is to record yourself reading your work and then play it back as you're revising.
Oh, wow.
Because
that sounds really brutal, because I know in the studio that's the most painful thing ever, is to play back in the monitor room, right?
Well, trust me, this is why I'm grateful I've never done an audio book. I know authors who go on podcasts and say, I never listen to it. I always listen to it because I want to know if I said something incredibly just bad, but really, just embarrassing. But on the other hand, listening to your writing is an opportunity to pay attention to things like line breaks, paragraph breaks, building suspension, building pacing into your work, paying attention to the arc of your work. Is there a climax in the essay that you're building up to? Is there a denouement where you're kind of winding things down? Are you actually paying attention to the writing as a piece of art rather than just a bunch of ideas that are strung together with transitions?
Yeah, no, it almost feels there's something transgressive about getting to talk about this. I mean, so one thing I found though is that one good thing is, so my dad's an evangelist, a lot of preaching, a lot of homiletics. I know what I like. As a debater, I always enjoyed getting paired. I remember I had a finals in Sonora with a member of the Black church, and I always saw that as I loved the challenge of because my dad's a Mexican American evangelist. He's not a Black Pentecostal preacher. But I think there's a style and a cultural thing there that I'm willing to pair up, and in a competitive environment, I'm happy to pose those. But one of the heartbreaking things is that when I went to college, I used the rhetorical and the kind of oratory presentation of writing well enough that I could fool a lot of people, including my teachers and academics. But whenever I hit the kind of stages where I really needed to know how to write, I found that the ear, in fact, failed me, and that I needed to learn to get to the eye. And I've read a lot of accounts of poetry of poetry is too much on the page, it's too stuck on the eye. But for someone who was all by ear, and I play by ear too, I actually needed to get onto the grammatical and the visual. And that's why for me, the line break, while the musical analogy to phrasing and stuff makes a lot of sense, George Benson, whistle while you play, all that. For me, I've actually had to almost detach my reliance on my ear, which is good enough, right? And it can emote, it can do a lot of stuff. It's great for Twitter or whatever. But if we want to raise the bar, I found that I've actually had to get down to my eyes and to the structure and grammar, on the page.
Yeah, I'm expecting copy edits for the book. So we finished developmental edits, which are, for those listeners who are not familiar with the process of book publishing, which, good for you. it's terribly difficult. Is that first you write a book and then you wait around for a while and then you get back what are called developmental edits, which is changing the ideas, changing the order of chapters, really digging into the thinking of the book. And then it goes to a copy editor who's somebody who goes minutely through, each sentence, looking for grammatical issues, looking for style issues, it's oftentimes fact-checking things or looking at sources. And in some ways, the developmental edits are a lot easier to handle than the copy edits, because your copy edits take a lot out of your ego, because you're I can't believe I made that mistake, right? I know that two independent clauses can only be joined by a semicolon. That's the only reason to use the semicolon. But here, look, I did it here, or I know this stuff. But the thing is, I too tested out of those comp classes, and I was thrown into, in my case, I started college as a classics major, and I had these very brilliant elderly Christian brothers. I went to a Christian brothers college who knew were drilled in grammar by nuns, probably. And they just they just let me have it, just like, and it was pretty brutal, honestly, but it did awaken me to the fact that I thought I was a good writer. I was good enough to fudge the SATs and stuff like that. But I think that's where copy editing and what you're talking about, getting feedback from somebody, like where you really see your soul in it. Of like, oh my God, I really do every time have that same thing that I do 500 times in this manuscript. So
I mean, in like research advising, and I know you teach research writing too, and in an oblique way, we've kind of been talking about it sort of critically, I guess. But I always go back to that old Strunk and White, write with nouns and verbs, subject, and I try to gently open it up to subject predicate sensibility. But I actually think that in many cases there's a sensibility that sort of the descriptive function of adjectives and adverbs and all of these kind of additional pieces will kind of decorate or add all this. There'll be super value added to a sentence or to an expression, and more and more I realize that I'm relying on those things when I don't have anything structurally inside the sentence to begin with, where I don't have a clear subject and I don't have a really clear action predicate, in many cases.
Right. I think that as you get more experienced in doing different kinds of writing, you learn to toggle back and forth between macro and micro a lot more, and rather than spending all your time thinking about, I can't get the sentence to work, it's like, oh, it's actually the paragraph. Oh, it's actually the whole essay. And I'm stuck on this one thing because my idea isn't there yet, and I need to go back. And so often that detail, that mining of really specific details, is where we realize that our larger ideas are, I don't want to say trash, but like sometimes it's like, well, this actually, I didn't think this through.
No.
And so that is a very self-revealing problem again. And that's where working with good editors, I mean, is such a lifesaver, because they can help you when you've done that. And I've turned in many a piece where it came back from edits and I'm like, oh my God, like I actually didn't know what I was, Kaya, this is really well written, but what the hell are you trying to say? So.
Well, I think that's again where sometimes there can actually, in fact, be an over-reliance on the sort of aesthetical presentation, and then you do get a kind of content review. All of these things I find is kind of over and under determinations in every direction. There was a part there about so there's something I say to students, and it's going to sound super mean, and maybe it is kind of mean, but ideas can be trash. But I actually think sometimes we think they're ideas where we don't have them. So I've had the student in some cases say, I have this great idea in my head, and it's there, but it just won't come out on the other end onto my word processor. And my general pushback is to say, well, if it won't come out, then it's not actually there. like maybe you're overconfident in this idea, and the fact that it won't actually make its way to the other side means that it just doesn't exist. Like it's literally just not real. And that's kind of tough. But in a way, it's different than saying it's trash, right? It's to say, I think sometimes we think we have ideas when we really just have kind of like thoughts, and maybe here there's a distinction to be made between a thought and an idea in sense of writing.
Right. I got a really good lesson on this from the journalist Jeff Charlotte, who I've known for a few years through Killing the Buddha, which is a web magazine he started with Peter Manso, who's also a wonderful writer. And I was really, really struggling with with an idea for an essay, and I was pitching it around, and I finally, like Jeff, I think we're on Twitter or something, and he said, let me DM you. It's like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble now. And he said, I think this, I can't remember what it was, but he said, I think it goes back to Vivian Gornick, talks about the situation and the story. Do you have a situation or do you have a story? So knowing what I tend to write about, it was probably some religion and politics thing, and like I had a situation, but I had no protagonist. I hadn't found someone. I want to follow this person's story, or I want to tell the story of this community, this neighborhood, this church, this school, and it has to have a beginning, middle, and end, or not, something like that. There has to be an arc. And that actually really helped me. Just that little bit of advice from Jeff really helped me a lot with.
So is the thinking here that if you only have a situation, it's sort of premature, it needs to become a story? Is that the advice, right? Okay.
That you need to do more. In my case, it would be reporting and research. In your case, it might be just research. In some cases, it's more thinking. And with our students, a lot of the time it's pre-writing.
Sure. That
they jump into writing a draft before they've done an outline or before they've done their research. Like students trying to write research essays, doing the research while they're writing, and I'm like, nah, it doesn't really work. So I scaffold my classes so that they have lots of steps involved, which doesn't work as well with Zoom, but it does. I try to think about that now a lot more when I pitch, or when somebody asks me for a pitch and says, I often will get asked to write pieces from editors who say, we're looking for a piece about blankety blank. Like, how would you approach this? And in that case, I have to come up with more of an angle rather than a pitch. Sure.
Could you say a bit more about pre-writing? Because there's this document. So for the doctoral dissertation, there's a ton of steps that involve getting up to the point at which you actually start dissertating. Which by the time you get there, I take a very mystical approach. Like at that point, it's sort of like magic and anything else you can find. Like it's sort of, I just abandon all ability to explain. But there's a document that a lot of my students have been creating that now I'm asking for, which they're calling a pre-proposal, where they really just write maybe 2-3 pages worth of, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I kind of want to do, here's what I've been reading maybe. It's sometimes they have this like archetypal story that sort of captures this concern they have and thematizes it. Anyhow, these kind of things are usually talking documents for the committee to sit around and figure out. But I'd love to hear more about the stage of pre-writing, because I think it's a stage that is not, at least within research, talked about sufficiently. What you have to write in order to write.
Right. So there's two forks to this road. One is, with academic writing. So with undergraduates, I might do something like, so we're going to spring break next week, and on their spring break, they have to come back with a one-sentence idea of what they're going to do their research project on. Then they do one paragraph, then they do one page, and then they do one page plus an outline. And then they do, of their first bibliography, and then their first draft. So, that's a really scaffolded approach to this with research writing. With journalism and with writing for a broader public, this often takes place in the pitching phase. When you say to an editor, I want to write an essay about, the siege of the Capitol and what this tells us about whatever. Sure. And the editor goes, well, we've already got somebody writing about that. So, but I like this part of your idea. So could you say more about that? And so it's that same, so it requires a degree of reciprocity. Pre-writing needs to be reciprocal as well. And so that's why I think writers should have, it's very important for us to have a writing group or something, even when you're a professional writer, to have editors who you really trust. If you're working with an editor for the first time, you have to build up that conversation of how are you going to help me with before I start to write? So when I'm doing stuff for Commonweal, for example, the Matt Sipman, he's somebody who in the pitching stage will really work with you to kind of figure out what the whole essay is going to do versus just here's a little nugget, come back in 4 weeks with something, because I think that's important to do. And I do that with Carrie Weber at America too. We often go back and forth on pitches who's the audience, what are you trying to say here, what's the idea. And that's pre-writing, is sort of like stretching before you exercise.
Sure, I love that.
Which I never do. That's why my back hurts.
Well, that's why I've given up on exercise. I just walk now. I walk in my forest, like I was saying. It's funny. I'm embarrassed to say this, actually. In my much more limited output in kind of popular writings, because over time, and I suspect that we might agree about this, because I started off taking a very indie approach, which I still feel is great for music, but I've learned that is not an environment for good writing. So the blog, the kind of self-published blog, even self-published books. I self-publish, early stuff, and some of it even got. I would place ads into things, and I was into the indie thing, because that was sort of the environment that was. In many ways, that was my dad's approach to ministry and all that kind of stuff. Cassette tapes that you recorded on your own little lapel mic, and then developed and brought the next prayer meeting, brought the tape and all that thing. So, having said all that, though, my most successful pitches, and feel free to let me have it, have actually been editors telling me, Sam, we believe you would write this thing really well. And it could in some cases be based on, like, you tweeted this like kind of wild sounding enigmatic phrase, but we think you can cash it out. We think you have the money in the account to cash it out. Do that. Or in other cases, like when I wrote the case for Biden, it was the editorial board being like, we kind of think you might be one of the only people who might be crazy enough to try to thread this needle, because we need it threaded just in this exact way, right? And so, knock yourself out. And I find that one of the things I love about that approach to the pitch is that I'm not really at a stage yet where I actually know what I do best. I'm much better off being told, you can do this. Why? Who knows? And being told, oh yeah, of course I can do that, so I'll go do it. And then of course after that there's a lot of back and forth, and in some cases I've been told afterwards, like, well, we thought you could do that.
Yeah, been there. I think it's interesting. It's about, in a lot of ways, it's about editors being there to help us give ourselves permission. And how interesting that we don't. Blogs are a way. The problem with blogs, and I want to caveat this statement because it's still a sensitive topic, right? To a lot of people. Are blogs, a legitimate form of writing? Are they healthy? Is social media healthy for writing?
Sure.
Is it healthy to just be writing, Rod Dreher style, 5 blog posts a day?
Yeah.
Is that good for your writing? And in his case, I would say no, because he's not evolving as a writer. What he's doing is dumping ideas, and I'm not saying this to dump on him, although I'm happy to do that too. By all means,
please dump on Rod Dreher.
But that what he's doing is he's giving his audience something to talk about, and that's what we do on Twitter. We give people something to talk about. You get to trade the mic of outrage, and blogs are really just, the writing in them tends to be pretty bad a lot of the time. And there's a lot of it, and they sort of peaked, and then they sort of have tapered off. So they were good for people. I had a lives journal. I wrote on that thing in my 20s, like, I'm feeling this way today. And I worked out a lot of my angst. But I think it's more about this paying attention to giving ourselves permission to write about things. So you're talking about somebody reads a tweet and says, I think you're the right person to do this, and puts the trust in you that you can build something on it, but they've probably been following your other work.
Of course.
And so like it is that you build up, a portfolio that showcases what you can do, but you do have to give yourself permission to kind of say, I think I'm the one to write about this, And so I'm going to pitch this idea, or I'm going to even write this tweet knowing that, 10,000 people are going to read it, and, 9,900 of them are going to say, idiot. And,
Oh, yeah.
and then 5 will actually engage with it.
Sure.
But that's the risk of putting your work out there. You have to first give yourself permission. Then you have to be willing to take what comes back. So with my students, again, a lot of it has to do with writing, them being very resistant to writing, them hating it, having had bad experiences in high school.
Sure.
We're a STEM school, so I don't get, almost all my students are STEM. And it's an opportunity for me to say this is another way to understand the world and to unlock things that you're interested in. But the difference with writing versus doing a lab report is that someone's going to read it, and your lab report, someone's just going to check it.
Yeah.
So I think it's, if they understand that they have agency and that they give themselves permission to see themselves as writers, and you're talking about academics giving themselves permission to see themselves as people who have ideas that are interesting enough for non-academics to read, or women giving ourselves permission to be in fields that are usually dominated by men, or writers of color, talking about entering publications that they are not represented in, and stuff. Like, we have to sort of allow ourselves to do that.
So this might be a good segue to talk a little bit about the book that's coming out in November. I have some another somewhat technical, nerdy thing to bring up with it, but feel free to talk about it at any length or in any way you like. So the title, because I think that the genre of the title is super difficult to deal with and work around, and I have 9 different views on any given day about it. And then, of course, I have all my titles, which I know we have the good titles that we know this was a good title, and we also know the ones that were bad. So your title is The Defiant Middle, and then the subtitle is How Women Claim Life's In-Betweens to Remake the World. I wonder if we could talk a bit about, as you've noted, and that was the second road that I think it might be good to walk on a little bit, questions of culture, of gender, of race, all these things. But also, if you don't mind, just talking a little bit about the title. One thing people may not realize is that, of course, titles are usually not only literary, they're oftentimes political, in the sense that they're negotiations between not only editors and writers and that intimate trusting bond, but even larger interest groups with the imprint or the press or what have you. So I wonder if we could talk about both the politics and the literary sense of the title, and your title specifically.
So this is not the original title, that the book sold under a different title, and this is the title that a committee arrived at. And I don't mean that in an insulting way. It was like my editor, along with publicity people, marketing people, have to get together and think about what are keywords that will explain the idea to people. And then, so my last book was about non-religious people, and I had come up with this kind of cute joke of like, the nuns are all right. And the problem is that, if you're not familiar with The Who and like that song, you're not going to get it. And so so the publisher added this really wordy subtitle, A New Generation of Seekers, Believers, and Those in Between. And so that's kind of like, I tell my students, this is like the keyword search.
Yeah.
So like the title is the kind of brand of the book, and then the subtitle with nonfiction books is what the keywords people are searching on the internet. And so my book was originally called Medieval because it's about liminal and in-between eras, and I was very drawn to medieval mystics as people who represent thinkers who were sort of like trapped in between, and especially women medieval mystics were trapped in between the expectations of what women should do, think, and feel in the era that they lived in, and how does that manifest today. But they were concerned that if I published a book called Medieval, everybody would think it was about the medieval era, which is, so the Defiant Middle came out of a lot of conversations about, again, you know, what is this book about, who's it for, who do we want to read it, etc. So yeah, it's again that awareness of audience is really important.
Who are some of the medieval mystics? I'm like, so in my head I was like, oh, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. This sounds like like, is she? Does she make the cut, or who makes the cut on that?
I wish. I do really love her, but to be honest about it, the person who ended up playing a sort of outsized role in this book and in my COVID life, because I wrote the book over last year, so it's very much my pandemic book in some ways. But is the person who ended up kind of taking over my thinking about how the world works is Julian of Norwich.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
And she became very important to me, as just personally, because I needed a pandemic saint.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I'm excited to read it. I think that the idea of the middle and the middle position, and this idea of like liminality and all that kind of stuff, it's in some ways perhaps been overworked on in certain conversations, but it's clearly been underworked within, I think, religious conversations, because so much of religious dialogue is actually about centers and about sides, right? But it's not really. It hasn't historically, I think, been very good about margins and middles and liminality and some of that stuff. You know, it's
right. Yeah, it came very. I would say that, given the fact that it was written during COVID and that, you know, it was not a good year for any of us, that it actually was a good book to be working on, because we are also trapped in between, you know, this nebulous future when we're all going to go back to, quote unquote, go back to things and the past and how it used to be. And spiritually, that's been a real struggle for a lot of people. And so it was a good book to be working on during COVID. So, yeah.
Oh, that's so great. One kind of leftover that I also wonder the extent to which it may come in here, or it may take us on a new path, is I mean, the context here at a kind of very obvious cultural way is that we're talking about English primarily, and you mentioned Ansal Duas, who's English and stuff. I've thought a lot about, I think, in the backdrop of Black Lives Matter and just the need I feel, especially, to overtly and distinctly see the beauty of blackness operating within, in particular, English letters. Is, you know, I was noticing from the very beginning of this interview, when it started, you know, Baldwin and Ta-Nehisi Coates, and then we went to Cornell West, that you mentioned. I've begun to form the view that actually there is a kind of there is an almost non-negotiable blackness to the English language that the writer must be able to contend with, regardless of their own personal identity or identification or how they present themselves. How would you take to that claim here? I mean...
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated as a white woman who grew up in Oakland, California, which was a majority black city in my childhood, and my mother was a teacher in the Oakland public schools, and my family, you know, is interracial in that we're white, but there are black people in my family through marriage. And so it is an interesting challenge to think about. And to talk with my students about this a lot too, is that line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. So, like, my husband is white and he plays Cuban music. And so at what point, can he learn Spanish or participate in Santeria ceremonies or travel there? He will still be a white guy from Berkeley, no matter what. And I'll always be, my whiteness is always going to be a filter between me and what I'm reading. And I think that the thing to remember is that Black writing and Black speech is American speech.
Yes.
So it is very much, and in the future, as we become California here, looking like the future of America, and Richard Rodriguez talks about this too, that we become brown, and that the fact that our country will also linguistically become like it's Black speech, but also like here in California, Chicanx, like Latinx speech, Asian American speech, all of these kinds of speaking. And what Ansel Du is talking about is like that wild tongue, right? That is the improper English. It can be very beautiful and very moving to hear people honoring that in their writing. But then you have this problem of again, the correcting of people's language and of people's English, the idea of proper English. And so that I find as a teacher it's difficult, because I want my students to write in a discourse of the academy so that they can succeed at Berkeley, but I want them to keep their voice and their culture in their writing. And so I think we talk a lot about this discourse and discourse communities and so on and so forth. And coming from here, I grew up with Black language as kind of like what I heard more than, white speech, so to speak, in my teachers and my classmates and my friends in my churches.
Yeah.
And so it's very familiar to me, but it's not mine. And I try so hard to resist the urge to, have a Black scent or to pick up the hood vocabulary. It's not mine. But I hear it and I recognize it. And I think that we're going to have to learn, and by we, I mean white people. So white people are going to have to learn to listen first and correct second. In other words, we have to become more familiar with the way that other people's Englishes work and understand it. So a Chinese student has a completely different way of understanding language than I do. That they don't have verbs, that they use metaphors for everything. And I have to understand I have to hear them say, this is how I'm understanding this, how I'm reading this, before I can say, here's how you can change it. Or here's some things you could try. So I don't know if that makes sense, Sam, but I think as we're coming to recognize Black writing as so central to American writing, that we will increasingly also recognize writing by people from other kinds of communities and other cultures as just part of this American and Canadian North
there's
American,
the Canadiana Americana thing, which is its own sensitive borderline. But no, I think, to me this is compelling because when we read Du Bois, and I have these almost obnoxiously pluralistic classes where I have students from Turkey and from Iran and from China and from South America and from we're the intercultural society that Canada is kind of known for, and there is a universality to Du Bois's prose. I mean, just his flat chops that cuts to the core of anyone who's literate in the English language, and shows them a kind of a poetic and a literary and an aesthetic standard that oftentimes scares them. And not in a sense, I'm not saying scaring like scary in a political sense or a punitive sense. I mean, it's so high. The bar is set so high for them. And I like to say, well, this is where the bar is for the American English language. This is the tradition for me that sets that bar. And you can read contemporary writers in this tradition, like Coates and others, who are continuing that, approach. And I just feel like, obviously, there's a lot of great writers out there, but within that tradition, I think all of us have to contend with the presence of this persistent quality of Black prose and Blackness within the American language. That's just so inspiring. And also, I'll admit it, I'm with them too sometimes. Pretty intimidating sometimes to keep up with, but great. Well, any last words you have for us for today?
I don't, but other than the fact that I have words and they're last. So, I mean, to summarize our conversation, I think it's really important for all of us to think about when it comes to writing and conversations of what we're saying, why we're saying it, who we're saying it to, and what we expect from them, and how are we prepared when they don't respond how we think they're going to. Like, sort of thinking a little bit more about who we are as people, deconstructing your ideas about your religion, your race, your gender, your social class, on a regular basis can make you a better writer because you're more able to hear voices that are different from your own.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Folk Phenomenology Season 1, and special thanks to Kaya Oaks. I would like to again thank my sponsors, Whippenstock Publishers, Give Us This Day, the Institute for Christian Socialism, Solidarity Hall, Revelation Cable Company, Black Catholic Messenger, Where Peter Is, the Juan Diego Network, and our featured sponsor for today, Commonweal Magazine. Commonweal Magazine is offering, as I said at the beginning, a whole year subscription to Commonweal for just $9.95. You can find the link in the show notes. If you're a student or a recent graduate, you can also sign up for a subscription to Commonweal entirely for free. I'd also like to mention that Commonweal has a podcast, which is among the friends of the show, and I just want to thank them for their sponsorship and their support for folk phenomenology. The friends of the show are the Commonweal Podcast, as I said, and also the Gloria Purvis Show, Disinherited Podcast, Davud Golsley, Up Too Late with Teresa Zoe Williams, Conversation on Tap, Saintly Witnesses, Kinder Conservative, The Show, Gregory B. Sadler, and Kush Classics. All of these friends of the show, like the Commonweal Podcast, are people that I know who are producing media that I think is important and that I believe in and that I listen to, and in many cases that I have been a guest on. And so I just want to give a warm salute to all of those wonderful friends, along with a very warm thanks to all of the sponsors. Make sure to check out the show notes for links, not only to Commonweal, but also to everyone else. And you'll also find their tip jar, which, if you do contribute, those contributions will be saved to kickstart what I hope to be Season 2 of Folk Phenomenology. For now, the most important thing, though, is to please share this episode and subscribe to the show. Every like, every retweet, every share helps. And I would encourage you in particular to say in some detail maybe what you liked about a show, or what stood out to you, or something like that, to give people who might be skeptics a chance to maybe find a place to dig in. Next week, I'm in conversation with Sarah Hogarth Rossiter, a philosopher and also a friend of mine here local in Vancouver. Because of COVID, we still had to interview over Zoom, but our conversation is wide-ranging. I've titled it Philosophy and Math, but in truth, it goes into everything from medieval logic and some of the assumptions of modern logic to the pedagogy and teaching of mathematics and some of the assumptions made about things like intelligence. Also some autobiographical details from Sarah regarding math and a few other things. In the end, though, she shares a really moving insight about a sense that she has of every person being in some sense a prophet. And she shares this as a way to make sense of her work and her vocation as a teacher. And I think that that sense of being a teacher that she shares is really the thing that I took from the conversation, as wide-ranging as it was. In Plato's Meno, there's this idea that all learning and inquiry is but recollection. The word for recollection in Greek is anamnesis. And one of the implications of this idea is essentially that everyone who has a soul, every person, can learn. Everyone can be educated. And I believe this radical yet very ancient philosophical idea of equality of intelligence that undergirds, I believe, a fierce commitment to a particular kind of education and to a particular kind of teacher. In this interview, Sarah presents herself as just one such kind of teacher, a kind of teacher who believes in this principle, a teacher who loves the world, dilexit mundum.
What is interesting to me, really interesting, and I can't define it, is because it's interesting. I can't say exactly what it is, but it's the most interesting, I would say, word, concept, idea.
My job is to somehow make them curious enough or persuade them by hook or crook to get more aware of themselves and where they came from and what they are into and what is already there, and just to bring it out. This is what compels me to compel them, and I will do it by whatever means necessary.
Love is where you find it. That's where you find it. That's where you find it. Love is where you find it. And you don't know where it'll carry you. And it is a terrifying thing. Love, it is the only human possibility, but it's terrifying. And
Through the eyes of our ears, we see the beauty of hope. We see the beauty of pain. We see the beauty